I have the privilege of bringing you probably the least technical part of the programming here, but that does not mean it will not be complex. We're going to be dealing with some really thorny issues in this panel, which is focused on ethics and law. And we are incredibly lucky to have not one, but two world-leading experts in both of those spaces with us. Vardit, you want to come up? And Glenn, I think, there we go. Literally coming at it from both sides here. We have a little bit of a Harvard Law versus Harvard Medical thing going on. That's right. So Glenn here is our representative of Harvard Law, where he is a full professor. Even if you don't know him by name, you have definitely read his work. I think he's been featured in literally every media outlet that there is. Vardit over here is the president and CEO of the Hastings Center, and she is also a professor at Harvard Medical School as well as the University of Montreal. Do I have that right? So she keeps busy. Now, these guys collaborate. They know each other very well. They do agree on a lot of things, but maybe not everything. So you might see some sparks fly here, which is okay. We want to encourage that. But I do think they agree on one thing 100%. Fully, which is that ethics and law cannot be afterthoughts. If they are treated that way, they can be barriers to progress. But if they are baked in from the beginning, they can be enablers of progress. They just have to be treated as design principles. And I think the fact that a lot of the topics we're going to talk about in the next 45 minutes have already come up in several other panels does suggest that many of you are thinking that way as well. And personally, that gives me a lot of hope for the future. So we're going to start off with, I think, the most basic, foundational, no pun intended, question that there is, which is, what is AI anyway? There's actually no consensus definition, and we saw a really remarkable illustration of this over the summer. So Technology Review, the publication put out by MIT, did a cover story, and the title of this was, "What is AI?" And the brilliant folks at MIT did not really have an answer. So we're hoping that Harvard can do better here. Sorry to my MIT people. Vardit and Glenn, how do you personally define AI, and how can we be expected to have coherent ethical and legal frameworks for something when nobody actually agrees on what that something is? Glenn, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'll look to a place you probably don't expect, which is the New Testament, believe it or not. And let me quote from James 2:18. "But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds.'" And the reason I say this is because AI is what AI does. What matters for the law, what matters for ethics is the deeds, the way in which it impacts patients' experience. Whether it's an algorithm, predictive analytics, old school regression, it doesn't really matter as far as the law is concerned. What matters is it right, is it wrong? How much care did you take in doing it? Now, saying that that's true from the law's perspective is very different from saying that's true from the patient's perspective. When you talk to patients and you say, "I'm using AI," in the best case scenario, they're thinking Star Trek. In the middle case scenario, they're thinking Battlestar Galactica. And in the worst case scenario, they're thinking The Terminator. They care a lot about this, and they don't understand it very well. And I think it's an important question to think about how we socialize this, because I will say it again, from the New Testament to Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky said in Crime and Punishment, "Man, the brute gets used to everything." This is a socio-technological system. We think about ChatGPT. There was a period of time when, like, oh, my kids are using it, my students are using it, there is this thing called ChatGPT, what is it? I enter its realm. Then suddenly it was like Microsoft Copilot on my Word document. Do I want to use this? Do I not want to use this? Now it's essentially like spell check. Do I need to take it off or turn it off? And then 5 years from now, it'll be a world where none of my students will ever have experienced a world without ChatGPT, and it's part of the firmament of the architecture. That is a choice about how we socialize and how we introduce it, and as much a choice in medicine as anywhere else.
That's great. Vardit, you want to respond to that?
Mary, I'll start off by saying that we disagree on a lot of things, but as you can see, we share a passion for shoes. It's just that I fall short.
The important things.
The important things. As to your question, what is AI? Of course, people disagree. And we can get incredibly philosophical about it. I was trained as a philosopher, so I love that. I've listened to dozens of hours of podcasts about what is AI while I fold laundry to be efficient. And I think that there's a spectrum of opinions. I'm surrounded by people who say, don't even call it intelligence. It's not, it will never be. It's just algorithms. It's just predictive. It can't really learn. That launches us into the debates about what is intelligence, what do we mean by learning, what is creativity. It triggers us to think deeply about some fundamental notions that we maybe took for granted until this technology showed up. And then there are people like Mo Gaudat, the ex-Google X, who has been saying it's more than intelligent, it's conscious, it has feelings. And recently, Yuval Noah Harari has been saying the A shouldn't stand for artificial because artificial implies that humans control it and we don't control it anymore. A should stand for alien. Not alien in the sense that it's from outer space, but alien in the sense that it's different from our intelligence. And in a way maybe superior to it. So there's all this spectrum of opinions about how well it performs. And my son, who's trying to find a partner in life, is telling me about dating apps that create, generate, based on generative models, your perfect partner that you converse with, and that, in that sense, when he develops emotions towards that avatar or invented identity, he of course projects emotions onto it. So I think this throws us into these really deep thoughts about what it means to learn and what it means to be human. All that aside, we cannot wait to have agreement on these philosophical questions because we need governance now as these tools are developed and implemented. So that makes me ask myself always, are we really dealing with something new here? I recently gave a keynote at the LCCon. That's the annual conference that unites all the LC researchers. LC stands for Ethical, Legal, Social Implications of Genomics. It's a research program funded by the NIH that started some 30 years ago with the Human Genome Project, based on the assumption that if we're developing such powerful technologies based on genomics, the ethics and the law has to be developed as we do it, not as an afterthought. And what I asked in this keynote is 30 years of research on LC. What have we learned that we can now apply to health AI? And I think we can learn so much. We have foundational principles and frameworks that can be exported, adopted, adapted to this new technology, and we need to be careful about the hype and about thinking that everything here is new. Data diversity, we had this issue in genomics for decades. Privacy and re-identifiability, we have this issue in biobanks. Consent to research, giving your DNA, when we can't tell you as researchers what exactly will be done with it in 20 years. Notions of blanket consent and menu consent, we've developed those. So there are so many examples of principles that we have worked on really hard, that are established, that we can apply now. And then we need to identify what's really new here.
That's great, thank you. So we've gone all the way from the New Testament to dating apps. I told you this one was gonna be fun. But maybe a slightly more practical question for our second one. We've heard that AI has the potential to accelerate so many things, right? Reiner mentioned that word multiple times. Biopharma is not really known for being fast. This is a field that often moves quite slowly, in some cases for very defensible reasons, right? We don't want anyone to get hurt. But AI is such an incredibly quickly evolving technology. How are we supposed to reconcile those things? How do you bring those completely conflicting timelines together? And I'm gonna frame this up a little bit differently for both of you. So Glenn, you first. How can we use the law to drive the rapid but responsible adoption of AI? And I want to refer back to something that we heard in one of the earlier panels. Gevorg, I think it was you mentioned the black box phenomenon. And there was this question, speaking of sparks flying, between you and Mark and others on that panel. about how is the FDA supposed to think about something that's a black box, or is it even a black box? So, Glenn, I'm wondering about your perspective on this, particularly in the context of models and technologies that are changing year over year over year, when a clinical trial can take much longer than that.
Okay, great. So let me answer this at two levels. Here's the top level. I want to talk about steak. You think, what, we're talking about steak, right? When you go to the butcher and you ask for a cut of meat, right, it's fit to function how they cut the meat, right? It's how things should be cooked, how it should be tasted, the different kinds of cuts of steak. FDA has the following problem. Its regulation of AI and AI in medicine is not fit to function. It's building vestigially on a set of categories that made sense in earlier eras and make sense certainly for other kinds of technologies. Drugs, devices, SAMD, SIMD. This makes a lot of sense, and they're trying as best they can to adapt to the function, right? Total life cycle management, right? The idea of assurance labs. These are all workarounds. But we don't have a system that is designed for the speed, for the issues with AI. So I think we have to give some grace to FDA that I think is doing a pretty good job in trying to build above this. But if you ask yourself and challenge yourself and imagine you were designing for a regulator that was only acting in this area, I think you'd find a very different list of things that you would want and a very different life cycle of development. Okay, that's the macro level. Coming down now to the questions about explanations, I completely and wholeheartedly agree with the person in the earlier panel that said explanations are great, but actually they're not the coin of the realm for most of the ways in which we live our lives, even in medicine. Most of the time, we are content to know that something works, not how or why it works. In that, to sound more philosophical for a moment, explanations are one epistemic warrant of trust, because that's what we're talking about here. Why should I trust this? Doctor, if you tell me to do this, why do you have any expectation, and why should I have an expectation this is going to help my life? And yes, understanding the mechanism behind something can be one warrant of trust, but it's not the only one, and often it's not the best one. In that we are often led astray by explanations and things we think we understand, when what we really want is evidence. Think about all the medical reversals we've seen in the history of medicine. Now, in theory, that would mean that what we should be doing is a lot more randomized trials. We're already seeing some, but not nearly enough in this space. The real problem, though, is the question of generalizability and localization. This was also reflected a little bit earlier. If it turns out you've done one randomized trial in one hospital and you get great results, what do you know? Do you know that it actually is going to work in another hospital? What are the criteria for the fragility of the results? And if it's going to require a separate randomization, a separate study design in each place you implement, now all of a sudden there's a huge increase in the burden and the cost of doing so. We don't do this in other areas of medicine. When we think about surgery and the way surgical innovation happens and the like, we don't require that level of localization. And one of the, I think, questions are whether AI, we might find ourselves somewhere in the middle in terms of this sort of thing. But I wholeheartedly agree that explanations, while great to have and can make people trust it, in fact, are not necessary and sometimes defeat the purposes of medical innovation.
Okay. Now, Vardit, I said I was going to frame it up a little bit differently, but I do want to circle back to this question of speed on a slightly different timescale. You've got AI, it's evolving incredibly quickly. And then you've got the human lifespan. So we get about 4,000 weeks, if we're really lucky. That number, you could probably argue, is too small. I think Dr. Topol would agree with that. Is there a moral imperative to use AI in healthcare, given the potential to increase lifespan, even if it's not quite mature enough and you're also introducing some risk?
I would argue, and it may be controversial, that absolutely yes, there is a moral imperative. And it's so interesting to me to sit in this room and get the vibe of excitement, of innovation, and wanting to run faster. Other rooms that I sit in, the bioethics room, are full of concern and worry and what barriers need to be created to be more cautious. It's just the tone is different. It's very exciting for me to be here and get this energy because for decades now, I have had issues with bioethics being perceived as the force that emphasizes the why not, the slowing down, the pausing. I think innovation is an imperative. You know, in 1948, when we composed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we included the right to benefit from science and its benefits as a universal human right. And then for decades, we've done nothing with this right. Governments have not operationalized it. It's not a motivator when it comes to this conversation that we're having. So I think bioethics is there not to be the sticks in the wheels of science. For many scientists, they meet the word ethics at the IRB level. It's where they're told what they cannot do, what they should not do. Bioethics should be a facilitator so that the innovation happens as fast as possible. The opportunity cost of not doing it is terrible. You know, I'm a part of the Bridge to AI initiative funded by the NIH, and I hear the other PIs talking about how every week that we're behind, we're not saving the lives that we could. So it's really embedded into this, the spirit of this project. But it has to be done responsibly and wisely. Because, and Glenn, sorry to agree with you. I know we're here to disagree with each other, but allow me on one point. Because if we don't advance with the appropriate caution and responsibility, it's going to impact trust. And we're just emerging out of a pandemic that showed us that science can deliver miracles and have the tools to save lives, and people reject those tools. I'm talking about the vaccines, of course, because of lack of trust. So it's not just about getting there, it's about getting there in a way that people trust, whether it's because their doctor told them or because it works or because they trust institutions to have appropriate governance. We must protect the trust. Without it, we can scientifically get there and not deliver the beyond 4,000 weeks that we all want.
That's great. Yeah, the risk is if we don't do it right, it'll backfire. And that's the way we'll do it wrong. One more for both of you. LLMs require a tremendous amount of data. So I'm wondering if there is a different moral imperative, which we could cast into law by mandating full data sharing, methods and data. And how do we balance that with the fact that patients want and need privacy, right? Researchers need the data, patients need to be protected. Glenn, you've got a wonderful quote about this, actually, which is that loose restrictions create distrust, but tight restrictions hinder research. So where's the right balance for both of you?
Okay, I'll start. So there's an area of this that's like regulatory, and the good news isn't always the case. My sense is the regulatory floor here is relatively easy for the people in this room to clear, right? If you're talking about stripping HIPAA identifiers, you're talking about having agreements with your data providers, this is all doable, right? The harder question, I think, is how far, especially in the United States, is doable. In the EU, elsewhere, the rules are a little bit more restrictive. The real question, I think, is how much ethically we think we should be above the floor and what matters and what doesn't matter. And I think many people are very tempted to think that the solution is just consent, that as long as I ask patients and as long as I get their permission, it's fine to do. And my own view is that this is, if not a waste of time, close to a waste of time, and that much of the way we do consent over data in this country, even in hospital systems, which is better than the click-through we do for Facebook and the like, is really an empty ritual, that we feel like we've said the magic words and suddenly that which is profane has become sacred and we are protected. It's not meaningful for patients. It's me as a patient who is extremely well informed. If you ask me, could I use your data to train my model? My ability to conceptualize all the things that model might do, how I would feel about them, what it might look like if I'm present in your data set and a million other data sets of triangulation, I can't figure it out. So if you're asking me about it, I'll give you an answer. But the idea that it's a meaningful answer, to me, really isn't true. I would much prefer less consent if it meant more governance. The idea of engaging patients more generally about directionality, groups of patients, communities of concern, community representation in the decisions rather than the level of individual decision making, because I just don't think people are very good at making individual decisions. The other criteria ethically to me is about equity. We had a great talk about equity and about thinking about this globally, but even domestically, this question about who is going to be the winners and who is going to be the losers. If your model is trained on patients across the US or across the world, but the results are actually deployed only in high resource settings, that's a mismatch. And the idea that I often think about data like taxation. People like oil, I think about it like taxation, especially in a more socialized medical system. The idea that we pay for innovation, we pay for advancement, we pay for support by sharing our data, and it's able to ask that of us because we are co-authors of the policy and also beneficiaries. When that breaks down, when it turns out I'm always in the excluded group, I'm always in the group that doesn't benefit, then the idea that we're making some grand bargain or some deal where I'm risking some identifiability in order to get some grand benefit, I think that breaks down too. So I always ask you, who is it who's going to benefit and who is it whose data is being used and what kind of overlap? I'll just say one more thing is that I've always been surprised that actually the people who make the least fuss about the intellectual property is actually physicians and nurses. Because most of the data we use in healthcare is co-produced by their observations, and yet we often think a lot and talk a lot about patient consent. But I think in some ways we don't really recognize the value of what our healthcare workers are giving into this. And they're much closer to the development of these systems in a way that I find interesting.
That's great. Vardit, I want to complicate this question a little bit based on some things that Glenn just shared with us. I know you've done a lot of work on what patients actually understand about how their data is used and more broadly about how AI works. So I'm wondering, what do we actually know empirically about how patients think about this? Do we have data or are we just kind of guessing at it? And is there an inflection point that you're waiting on where we go from a patient is very worried that AI might be involved in their healthcare to the patient's worried that it's not?
I can't speak to all the research that's done out there. A lot of it is in the process of data collection and hasn't been published. So what I can say is that we don't know a lot. We don't have, as far as I can see yet, a robust literature on how patients see these tools, what they understand, what they care about. But I will share without too much detail because it's unpublished at this point, a study that I'm one of the authors on this paper. We surveyed 1,500 patients, that's quite a lot. And it was almost a controlled trial because some of them chatted, messaged with a human provider, and some of them with AI, with a chatbot. And then we asked them about their level of satisfaction based on the responses that they got. And those who chatted with AI, and this is now one study of many, some speakers have mentioned this is emerging in a pretty robust way. They were more satisfied when they chatted with the bot. The answers were longer, there was more patience, more empathy. We've heard this over and over again today. But then we told them which was which, and those who chatted with AI all of a sudden were less satisfied. So this triggers all those interesting questions of what patients actually care about. Is it just the bottom line outcome, my satisfaction, my better diagnosis, my better treatment option? Or is this something about the process, the interaction, the authenticity of the communication that is happening? And we are asking in this paper, okay, if they prefer to chat with AI, but they don't want to know it, does that ethically mean that we should just not tell them, or that we should be transparent because the honesty, the trust, the authenticity are values that are more important than your bottom line sense of satisfaction? So I think we just began to explore these clusters of issues. In the bioethics literature, there's a link that is being constantly made between transparency and explainability and trust. The more we open the black box, the more patients and clinicians can see inside and understand, the more they will trust. Glenn alluded to that. Is that really so, or do people trust just what works best for them? In the past, I used to ask groups, if you had a choice between better prediction, better treatment, and a more empathic, compassionate care, which would you prioritize? Now we don't have to ask that because it seems like AI would provide both. So I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done to kind of probe deeper what it is that we care about. Do we feel less satisfied when we discover that it's AI because we feel cheated in some way? You know, it's like your mom got a great Mother's Day card from you, and then you told her that ChatGPT wrote it, and she feels somehow that violated the relationship. So is it just about being transparent about it, or is it about physicians being trained to do better? I mean, there are so many ways to look at this. Very, very complex issue. But I think the bottom line is that we don't know enough yet about what patients care about and what clinicians care about. I'll say a word about your issue of when does it flip. You know, for the last couple of years, I heard people say, ooh, I don't want AI to read my images because I trust my provider. Mm-hmm. And now, in front of our eyes, it switches to, I told David Wald at lunch, in New York, we see ads for clinics who provide mammograms, and they advertise your mammogram will be read by AI, as if that gives them competitive advantage. That would attract you to them because you already trust that you would get better care if you rely on that tool. So when does that flip happen? And I think with genomics, we saw that it can happen quite fast. I'll give you a quick example. I've been studying genomics technology, NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, probably the fastest spreading genomics technology in recent years. Pregnant people really want this technology. And for a while, for a few years, physicians were reluctant to offer it. They didn't understand how it works. It was completely new, based on, you know, cell-free fetal DNA. Clinicians didn't understand what that meant, how to interpret the results, so they didn't offer it to patients. And then it spread so fast that and they were afraid of they would be liable for offering it. From almost one day to the next, they became afraid of being liable if they don't offer it. So when is that magical point of that became standard of care? That became the expectation of patients. It's hard to pinpoint, but it happens very fast, and it's happening with some of the AI tools right under our eyes. So I think it's critical to train the workforce so that physicians can meet those expectations and those liability concerns, and offer really the best that we can based on evidence that is shifting in front of our eyes.
That's great. So you guys heard it here first then. We are shifting from AI as Terminator to AI as, well, maybe we're not quite to Star Trek yet. Are we in Battlestar Galactica phase, maybe? You mentioned training the workforce. We have heard the word democratization quite a bit today. I want to ask about democratization in the context of the workforce. Because that is one thing that AI can do. It can democratize expertise, if you will, or at least knowledge. That sounds great unless you are a clinician who's spent 20 years training and now you're deeply worried about being obsolete. So I would love a take from both of you on that. And then I'd like to pivot to the other angle that we have on democratization, which is another topic we've heard about quite a bit, which is equity. But let's talk about clinicians first. How worried should they be, or should they?
Okay, so here is how it was first sold to you, which was the Centaur model, which is essentially, don't worry, it's always going to be human, AI hybrids, and you're going to be in the loop, and you're just going to be better at your job. And that was like the early phase of studies said that. Then the next phase said, well, maybe if you're a senior physician, that's true, but the junior physicians, not so much. And then as Dr. Topol showed, the most recent set of results turns out to see you're not, in the Centaur, you're not the man, you're not the horse, you're the horse's ass, essentially. You're the one who's getting in the way of the progress. Now, that is a fragile result, right? It's a question about how many implementations and where we see it and what are the conditions in which we can predict better or worse. But I think the reality is that if you thought that you were always going to be adding value, we've got some news for you, you're not. That's actually great news, to be perfectly honest, maybe not for you, but for the world, because it turns out if essentially we thought you were the end-all and be-all of everything, right, the value of investing and spending all this money in creating these systems were much, much less. And the good news is you have a 24/7 day, right? You have a certain number of hours, you get tired. The AI is scalable in a much greater way. So for me, this is an optimistic story, potentially, about the democratization of expertise. But here's the problem. Most of the investment thus far is focused on making those of you who are clinicians, who are very good at your jobs, even better. In fact, ethically speaking, the big value would be taking very mediocre physicians and making them available and their skills available to a much broader swath of the population, whether it's urban, rural, LMICs. And one of the questions is whether we have an alignment between the ways in which things are reimbursed and the way in which things are kind of paid for. Because if you can't pay for it, you won't get it built. So for me, this is the question, is to say, what are we spending money on? And are we spending money on the thing where the big ticket ethical value is? And my own sense is no. And unless there's major course correction, we won't get there.
Okay. You want to respond to that?
I'm afraid I absolutely agree in terms of reimbursement. There's resistance to change in big systems, and sometimes it's about following the money and making these improvements worthwhile for everybody. But we have to stay patient-centered and patient-focused. Medicine is not about creating jobs and protecting jobs. It's about providing a service. It's about providing care. So we need to go to the place where the care is optimal. I think that in terms of the integration that Glenn talked about, we used to say in rooms like this for the last couple of years, it's not that AI will take your jobs, it's that doctors who use AI will replace doctors who don't use AI. The notion of doctors who don't use AI will probably become obsolete really fast, although it was fascinating to me when Regina, I think, asked us to raise our hands if we personally interacted knowingly with AI tools and nobody raised their hand. There is a certain gap between the vibrant excitement in this room and what's happening out there, and I think identifying those obstacles is an ethical imperative. Is it reimbursement? Is it governance that doesn't keep up? Is it psychological resistance to change and people afraid of losing their jobs? Where do we have bottlenecks that we can release so that all the innovation potential present here can actually make it out, and in an equitable way and in a global way? But it's clear that the resistance cannot be about people, professionals, maintaining their authority or power or position. It has to be about optimizing. And one of the tools that I see now everywhere people struggling with is the ambient recordings in order to take clinical notes. And it was sold to healthcare systems under the mantra of, oh, don't you want the doctors to be able to take their eyes off the screen and look at the patient and interact with the patient? Is that actually happening? The time that it's releasing, the burnout that it's supposed to reduce, is it actually getting to those goals, or are we just adding other tasks? So a lot of it is about managing the system appropriately so that, as Glenn said, physicians and healthcare providers in general can use their precious, precious time to make us feel better, whether it's psychologically or physically, and not just developing these tools because we can and then failing at the point of implementation.
That's great. So you said patient-centered. Let's then consider the flip side of this question of democratization for patients. We have heard some amazing things today from Joan and others about how we can use these tools to address inequities. But there is also, I believe you asked the question of Dr. Topol, aren't you concerned that this could exacerbate inequities? How should we be thinking about that broadly? And then what about some specific potential solutions, particularly with data collection? Should we be thinking about not just consent, but compensation?
I've gone first the last few times, so I'm happy to turn it over to you to go first this time. Okay. I think the idea of compensating patients for their data is completely, and maybe we'll disagree about this one, is completely wrong, right? It's because, again, I understand why we compensate people for their work. We need to incentivize productive labor. The fact that you're sick turns out not something that I want to incentivize you to be sick, right? There's no reason to do this. I'm observing a fact about you, and I don't think you have any claim to be compensated for that. What you have a claim to, I think, is if that fact helps generate a great innovation. That innovation becomes just as available to you as it would to many other people. And to me, that's the kind of, when we think about compensation, what's owed, that's the way to think about it. The moment we start asking patients to pay for their data, first of all, they're going to overestimate how valuable their data is, and the transaction costs to me are just a nightmare. So to me, I would definitely not go in that direction.
Okay, we heard the word ludicrous. What do we think, Vardit?
Pragmatically, I agree with Glenn, but I want us to keep in mind the cautionary tale of the HeLa cells. And what happened historically when there was a public perception of an approach that was unjust, that was exploitative, that used certain populations to benefit other populations. Again, I'm kind of repeating Glenn here. But if the governance structures are seen as just, then I don't think we need to pay specific patients for specific data sets. But we have to be very cautious about building structures that seem overall at the population level exploitative and benefiting, risk benefiting in the wrong, without the right balance. I want to use my 1 minute to say a word about diversity. It's obvious, I think if you look at the bioethics literature today, data diversity is possibly the #1 concern, because it's clear that if we don't have representative data, it will end up not fixing gaps, not closing gaps, exacerbating them, et cetera, et cetera. It was said a million times today. But one thing that we sometimes pay less attention to is what kind of diversity do we need? So in this Bridge to AI initiative that I mentioned, there are different types of data sets that are being built, and they're supposed to be ethically sourced and ready for research using AI. And one of them, Emma, that was on a panel this morning, Cell Maps, looks at the architecture of the cell, and then there the diversity means one thing, but I'm sitting on another project that collects voice samples. We record thousands of patients to use AI to look at voice as a biomarker for disease. And all of a sudden, diversity has a very different meaning. At the DNA level, it's maybe your ancestry. All of a sudden, it's accent, age. What does a baby sound like? What do you sound like as you age? There are so many other elements of diversity when you think about voice as your data set, compared, for example, to DNA. And interestingly, I gave a talk about AI recently to a lovely group of folks, the Yale class of 65. So they're all over 80, vibrant, sharp, amazing. And the first question they asked me about diversity was, is our population represented in the data sets? And I was like, what do you mean? They said, between 80 and 100. How many do you have in those sets that represent us and our health concerns as we're approaching 100? So when we say diversity, it's not that easy to understand what we mean, for whom, and who gets to decide what it means to have a data set that is truly representative.
That's great, thank you. We are close to time. I think we have time for one more question, and then if there's any more time beyond that, we can either do some audience Q&A or you can catch them at the break, which is immediately after this. I'm sorry, they're gonna mob you both. Final question though. Glenn, I think you're the person who wrote that AI is often most useful when it thinks of something that a human might not have. But those may be the trickiest cases and the ones that are most fraught with liability. So if a patient is harmed due to a decision that was either made by or driven by AI, where do you feel like the liability should lie? So there's our legal aspect, but also the accountability. Who's really responsible? And then with that in mind, for both of you, do you think that means there are some aspects of decision-making where maybe the human not only needs to be in the loop, but the decision always lies with the human and the AI is not in the loop?
Great, let me give you the bad news first because I'm a lawyer, and then I'll give you the good news. So we'll start with the bad news, right? The bad news, if it turns out, if you make a decision as a physician that causes an adverse event, Whether that's because you shook a magic 8-ball or you listened to the new AI system, either way you are going to be sued, and if your decision was below the standard of care of what other physicians would have done in the circumstance, you may be found liable. So that's the bad news side of it. The good news side of it is that actually there are radically very few cases involving specifically AI and liability. This is like the first question I'm always asked when I say I work on this. I think somebody did a study, they found about 27 reported cases total since the year 2000 where AI was centered outside of the Da Vinci robot, which is a little bit of a special case here. So in reality, I think people overestimate the risks of liability much further, so much more often a reason to get to know that they shouldn't. In terms of where the accountability should lie, we expect physicians to be wise adopters and wise users of very sophisticated artificial intelligence. We are fooling ourselves in thinking that they are well positioned to do so. My own view is it would be much better to put more liability on hospital systems who do have the governance structures, do have the time, and do have the opportunity to actually kick the tires and to decide whether this is a wise adoption and implementation for their hospital system. So less liability for physicians, more for hospitals.
Okay.
And I'll take it even higher. Currently, healthcare systems can purchase AI-powered tools without governance over their heads. They're basically, products are being pitched. Whoever's responsible for adopting makes the choice to purchase. The workforce is being trained, and it's there. So as a physician, if it's been embedded, your ability to not use it is already or very soon will be very limited. So I think the issue of liability is going to be giving you, Glenn, a massive headache in the years to come because there are all those levels. There's actual federal and state regulation that will have to come, and then there are the decisions that healthcare systems will be making, and then the physicians will be quite low in the food chain in terms of their ability and authority to make those decisions. They'll still maybe be liable in court, but in some cases almost unfairly. I want to end with a project that we're currently running at the Hastings Center called What Are Humans Good For? And that looks into the future, into a time where the predictive power and the empathy and everything will be provided by the robots and the surgeries, and what are we going to be good for? And even if we say care and compassion, we just heard that in some cases, even in that sandbox, we can't win. So the National Academy of Medicine is currently running a beautiful project to create a code of conduct for AI in health. I'm honored to be on the steering committee. It's beautiful to see that Google and Microsoft are there, as well as some big healthcare systems, Kaiser, Mayo. So this is a beautiful example of a partnership and a collaboration across sectors. And one of the core fundamental principles of the Code of Conduct, it's about to be published, so don't say I told you, is human connection. Even if AI can replace us or do better than us at specific points, I think the journey, the care journey, being a patient, being vulnerable, needing somebody that understands, and not just because I'm projecting feelings onto a machine, I think the human connection will and should and must remain an indispensable part of the equation. And there are things that AI will never be able to do for us.
Amazing. So that was quite a human connection right there. We are at time, so I'm going to put you all out to break, but remind you, these folks are here. They'll be here at the cocktail reception as well, and discussing philosophy on a stage is fun, but discussing philosophy over cocktails is even more fun. So please be sure to find Glenn and Vardit, and thank you both.
Thank you.